Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, where we invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. This is the Roundup episode for Violent Majorities, Indian and Israeli Ethnonationalism, which you know by now was hosted by two fabulous anthropologists. Hello, fabulous anthropologists, Ajanta Subramanian and Laurie Allen. So that makes this, I guess, a kind of three-host night. So in episode 1, Ajanta and Laurie spoke with Balmurli Natarajan about such fascinating topics as the slippery slope to a multiculturalism of caste in India, while in episode 2, just 2 weeks ago, Natasha Roth-Rowland joined them to discuss territorial maximalism in the Israeli right and whether the most extreme ethno-nationalists should be seen as radical non-state actors or as indissolubly wedded to established political ruling parties. So if you haven't listened to those yet, I think you should just hit pause right now and listen to them. So you have 1 second, go. Okay, you're back. Great. Today, Ajanta and Laurie and I are going to discuss our findings with me playing the role of ingenue or dumb rube, which, as listeners will know, comes extremely naturally to me, giving them a chance to emphasize and also unpack further what they think are the key ideas from those conversations, and ideally, I think, to build the bridge between them. So before we dive in, let me just guestify our two hosts. So Ajanta is professor at CUNY Graduate Center, and she's a historical anthropologist specializing in the political economy of caste. Her work includes Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, Stanford 2009, and The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, Harvard University Press 2019, which analyzes meritocracy as a terrain of caste struggles in India and its implications for democratic transformation, and additionally was the subject of Recall This Book 22 back in February 2020, Before the Dark. Highly recommended, just before the dark. And Laurie Allen is an independent scholar and professorial research associate at SOAS, University of London. Her work includes a 2013 book from Stanford, The Rise and Fall of Human Rights, Cynicism and Politics in Occupied Palestine, and A History of False Hope, Investigative Commissions in Palestine, also Stanford 2020. They are both brilliant beyond words. I can't wait to get started. And I'm just hoping, Ajanta, maybe you could start us off with something that you wanted to single out as particularly illuminating from the talk that you and Laurie had with Murli.
Sure. So there was a lot in that conversation with Murli. I think one thing that was super helpful was his characterization of the Hindu nationalist project as having a kind of twofold structure. So he talked about how in the effort to manufacture hegemony, that this project treats Muslims and Dalits, so Dalits are the sort of former untouchables of India, that the project treats them differentially, right? So it constructs the Muslim as the racialized external other, and the Dalit as the ethnicized internal other. What was particularly striking was he said that the racialization of the Muslim, which actually quite explicitly draws upon kind of fascist discourses about the Jew in the early 20th century, and I think we'll get to that later. But he said that the racialization of the Muslim is actually easier to accomplish, and that often it's done through the use of both state and vigilante violence. But that the making of the Hindu us, so the making of the Muslim them is easier to accomplish, but the making of the Hindu us through the incorporation of Dalits and other populations is actually much harder. And the way he put it was, Hindutva has a harder time constructing the people, right? The people that is the key to growing it from an elite project into a mass movement. Right. And this is because so many of the constituent parts of the Hindu us, so not just Dalits, but a whole bunch of others, are recalcitrant subjects. Right. And so, for him, this project consists of this constant back and forth between claiming these recalcitrant groups as part of a national majority, the Hindu us, and deeming them anti-national or part of the ever-expanding them when they refuse to comply, right, with Hindu nationalist ideology. So this this instability of the boundary between the us and the them, that's the easiest way to stabilize that boundary is violence, right? So I think these were some of the things which for me were most provocative about the conversation with him. And I think it also connects well to the conversation about Israel, right? Because I think, in the Israel case, you also have this tension around who is the us and who is the them.
Yeah.
And the them can be this sort of ever expanding category, right? That at one moment might be just the Muslim and the Palestinian, but at another moment could also include the liberal, the secularist, the queer, the whatever, right?
Yeah. Can I actually follow up a little bit on just that first move, Ajanta, about because I think you're saying something more than just that sort of straightforward thing that people often say about sort of nationalist focused governments, which is that they work well on a friend-foe distinction, that sort of Carl Schmittian move of making that it's easier to demonize than it is to consolidate.
Yes.
But you're actually saying something more about the slipperiness of the need for, especially, I guess, Dalits to both be inside and outside of the body. Is that right? I mean, is that they are... I'm trying to connect this to that phrase of his that I love, which is the slippery slope of the multiculturalism of caste, like the way in which you can account for caste as a form of cultural diversity, which allows you to do this sort of double work. Yeah.
Right. So that's what he means by ethnicization, right? That ethnicization is the idea of horizontal difference, right? Right. That it's a kind of obscuring of the violence of hierarchy, right? So caste is a particularly important sticking point for the Hindu nationalist project, because it's very difficult to talk about caste as anything other than violent hierarchy, right? And so to ethnicize the Dalit is to somehow obscure that reality of caste, right? And to make the coexistence of different castes into a form of happy multiculturalism. Hindutva has become more of a mass politics, right? Especially in the last 30 years. So groups that you think would have been far more resistant and would have seen through these overtures, right, have actually become conscripted into this project. So obviously there's something that it's offering them, right? And I mean, he had sort of different takes on what that might be, right? So, I mean, he talked about kind of disenfranchised youth, right? Men in particular who derive a sense of satisfaction and pride from being foot soldiers, right? In this project.
Didn't we hear about Hilltop Youth in Israel? I wonder if there's a connection there.
There's a connection.
I think it's really important to understand the kind of ego satisfaction that's given to especially men and young men through these kind of violent thug groups that go out and assert themselves and are seen to give them prestige as well as standing within their communities. In terms of the Hilltop Youth, which are, the kind of Israeli young men thugs, I don't know if... I think there is some research that shows that a lot of these people are folks from lower rungs of society that feel like they're being given or are taking a place in society that is important, right? Important to the nation, to such an extent that the Israeli army has in fact started to try to incorporate them as, they wouldn't call it this, but as shock troops, essentially, in the West Bank. But I think I was just hoping that we would move to this kind of materialist analysis and not just rely on kind of the ideological categories. I think that in Israel, one of the dynamics that Natasha helped us understand was the way that what was far right or more radically right gets co-opted into the state, and what is the center and what is the right is constantly shifting ever rightwards. And there isn't, I don't think, a parallel kind of hierarchization of Judaism or Zionism. Obviously, I mean, the Ashkenazi have traditionally had more economic power and political power, but the whole point is that in both of these projects, both of these ethno-nationalist projects, the goal is political hegemony. And the place of the state in that goal has changed over time for different groups, whether or not they are committed to the state or are anarchist and outside the state, like Natasha described the Hilltop Youth as. But the point is that they want to redeem the land, however they are defining that, in a politically hegemonic way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she actually said that the Hilltop Youth could almost be thought of as anarchists at one point, right? That they were anti-state, and they've since become the state. So yeah, so that was one instance, or even the natalist policies that were so central to the far right, right? This idea of demographic warfare. I mean, that was the other thing that she said was widely shared, right? So I think when you scratch the surface, you see that the ideological spectrum is not so much a spectrum as a kind of set of shared principles.
But I think what the distinction is these different far right groups have a different orientation towards the state at different moments. And so the Hilltop Youth are a group who were, she said, had been hostile to the state. And she described them as even a kind of anarchist, as Janther recalled. But what I'm pointing to is the fact that even they are also getting incorporated into the state. Similarly with, the religious right has slowly become increasingly powerful within the Israeli army and the military services. They have, because of their kind of greater discipline, apparently risen in the ranks. And so there are more religious right officers within the army. So in all these different ways, we're seeing elements of the state be taken over by the far or extreme right.
So I have, in fact, sorry.
No, yeah. I think that she tracked was one where there's a kind of increasing blurring of the boundary between the far right movement and the state, and between state violence and extra parliamentary violence. But she also said that, at different moments, it was convenient to externalize certain forms of violence as non-state, right? And this is another shift. She said, like, in 1994, when Bart Goldstein goes and shoots up the mosque in Hebron, that the alibi at the time that was preferred was that, well, he was an American settler, that this was a kind of imported extremism, right? But that kind of alibi is no longer necessary. And in fact, there's been a total embrace of vigilantism as necessary and legitimate, right? So you've got Itamar Ben-Gvir like handing out guns to settlers to go and, take over the West Bank.
And the acceptance of this kind of vigilante violence and the pushing of the red boundaries, of the red lines of what is acceptable violence, is also a reflection of our global moment as well, right? Where we've seen a shift of extreme right parties become more central to governments across Europe as well. And, we might even say the United States has had moments of this.
Actually, that's a great point to connect to another topic that came up, I thought, in both, and that we were also thinking about informally, as the connection between a diasporic minoritarian presence in other countries and basically extremist majoritarian logic of these in-country ethno-nationalism. So, Lori, I totally take your point about the rising ethno-nationalism within the places that diaspora is located, and I think we should very much include the United States for that. But nonetheless, those are groups that are operating as minorities within that complex ethno-nationalist context in the West, also looking back towards, both India or Israel. So thoughts about that, about the way that these conversations helped us think about that tension or that duality?
I mean, it's interesting because, I think, again, I think one of Natasha's main points is that we have to think about the far right as always already transnational, right? That Jabotinsky, where was he again? Where did he?
Poland. He was
Poland,
from,
that's right.
Didn't he die in America though, Jabotinsky?
I think so. Yeah. But it was even in this moment. I mean, there's a great book by this guy Heller called Jabotinsky's Children, which traces the development of Betar, the youth wing of the revisionist movement, and the transnationalization of that from early on as part of their political project. Was a way of gaining power by bringing American Jews into the picture.
And that recent novel, by the way, The Netanyahus, and we spoke to the author on Recall This Book, that is fascinating about Jabotinsky's children, about the spiritual heirs and their diasporic impact.
So I think in the Israel case, it's, her argument is that we have to think of this as transnational all the way through.
I see.
In the Indian case, I think it's a slightly different trajectory. So the Hindutva project is also transnational from the outset, insofar as it derives a lot of its inspiration from European fascism, right? So in that sense, ideologically, it's part of that same formation, right? Right. It starts. I mean, Murli has had a kind of interesting way of pushing it back to the late 19th century. But I think a lot of people see, I mean, if you think about the RSS as the first kind of institutionalization of the Hindutva project, right? The RSS starts in 1925. And they're using a lot of the same language, right? I mean, one of their founding fathers even travels to Italy to meet Mussolini, right? Wow. So there's so there's a kind of fascist diaspora, right? And in an ideological sense that all of these groups are a part of. But in terms of actually having a presence in the US, for instance, that's much later.
I have a question about the timing of this. Is it more a case of the Indian diaspora becoming important to the Hindutva project once the Indian diaspora in the US becomes a strong ethnic minority in that context, strong economically, educationally, politically?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially there's an effort to kind of, exploit the anxiety, the sort of cultural anxieties of the diaspora, right? And this is happening not just in the US, but in other parts of, in Trinidad and Mauritius.
And the UK itself as well.
And the UK. So you've got Hindu nationalist outfits starting organizational work in all of these places. And what they're mainly doing is, doing summer camps for kids and, sort of trying to address the anxieties around cultural loss, right, that are being expressed by people in the diaspora. And I don't know at what point that begins to translate into much more active financial support, right, for the Hindutva project in India. I mean, it's very clear in the early 90s that's already happening, right? So there's a movement this is where the BJP, which is the sort of political wing of the RSS, really gains strength, parliamentary strength, right? Was around this, through this mobilization around destroying a 16th century mosque in the northeastern
Ayodhya.
Yes, in the northeastern city of Ayodhya, and so there's this whole story about how this mosque is actually the birthplace of the god King Ram and needs to be sort of reclaimed, and the only way to sort of avenge this hurt to Hindu sentiment is to sort of destroy the mosque and build a temple. And for that, there's a ton of funding that comes from places like from both the United States and the UK, right? But I'm not sure how early those financial links are forged.
Can we tell an interesting story about the analogous forms of diasporic nationalist support to the case of the Jewish diaspora and Israel, which I recognize is different because it's in a way triangulated, because most of that Jewish diaspora comes from Europe originally, not from Israel itself. But yeah.
The idea of diaspora assumes an originary homeland, and so that is actually part of Zionist ideology, to claim that Jews around the world are part of a diaspora, whereas in fact that is a side product of this nationalist project. So that's a first sort of thought. So the Jews of Europe are not a diaspora. They were folks that the Zionist project could call in, right? Or leaders of the Zionist project. And of course, it's the American Jewish people who have been among the most influential and supportive world, parts of world Jewry for Israel and the Zionist project. And what's interesting there is that, originally American Jews were not so head up about Zionism. They were maybe supportive kind of from afar, but not in a way that made them want to move there. And I actually did an interview with an NYU historian, Zach Lockman, in the journal Merit, where he gives this history. But what's interesting to think about is the history of this, in which it's really the 1960s, where American Judaism becomes more tightly inclined towards Zionism and more tied to Israel and the Israeli project. And that's partly a result of what happened in the 1967 war, where Israel came out as victorious. And so it was kind of a prideful international nationalism that brought them to affection for Israel. But it's also been a concerted effort among lots of people to create a link between Jewish American identity and Israeli American identity. And you can see that in cultural ways that are also religious, right? Like, so there's an Israeli flag in people's temples from that period on. Kids get drawn into these campaigns to raise money to plant trees in what are essentially settlements in Israel, right? So there are all these ways, similar maybe to what the Hindutva folks do for kids in raising a kind of consciousness.
The 1960s, as you said, Lori, is really key because of the 1967 war. But she also said that there's this earlier moment in the 50s when, as part of Americanization, right, you've got a kind of conservative turn away from communism, right, which was the other internationalism that was really important, right? So there's a kind of so there's a kind of an internal fracturing of the American Jewish population with sort of Americanization being expressed as a disavowal, right, of Jewish communists. So she talked about that.
That's
as
more
sort
in her dissertation than in the conversation, I think.
Yes, but that's like the precursor to then what happens in the late 1960s, right? So there's Americanization in the 1950s, and then there's kind of a turn towards Israel in the 1960s. And there's an interesting way that these two things kind of converge, right? So there's a political conservatism and support for Israel that kind of comes together, right?
I totally agree with the word interesting, but I just also have to say, as like somebody who's currently resident at Brandeis University, where the question of suturing Zionism to Jewish identity and saying that every form of anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism is so alive and well that although it is interesting, it's also profoundly depressing to me to think about that as a legacy of this, this sort of constituting of American Jewish identity, through the lens of Israel, because, I was sort of, born and raised into the myth. It was a myth as well of the notion of like the Jewish value in America of cosmopolitan or universalism that embraced minority identity precisely because minority rights could be protected through some kind of universalism, of which the university seemed like, an instantiation at least. And now to be at a university that prides itself on particularizing by way of Israel, it just hits home to me at this particular moment. But although I completely agree with you that it is interesting, it's also kind of awful. So I just want to say that.
It is awful, but it also, I think, is important for us to recognize the immense amount of work and institutional energy that has gone into getting us to this point wherein there's an equation between Israel and Judaism, an equation between anti-Israeli critique and anti-Semitism. This has been institutionalized in Europe and in the US, especially these days, through the IHRA redefinition of anti-Semitism, and specifically the illustrative examples that state quite baldly that critique of Israel is anti-Semitic. But that didn't come out of nowhere, right? This has been a very successful campaign supported by the Israeli state itself. So I think in this moment where we're probably all looking for ways of understanding how any of this can come unraveled, recognizing those institutions and the funding sources of those institutions, those funding sources being groups that benefit from tax breaks in the United States. There are places where there are spaces to lever out the sutured together.
One more thing about Zionism, I mean, it's so important to sort of combat these equations, right, between Judaism and Zionism. But also because Zionism is becoming a kind of model for other long distance nationalist projects like Hindutva, right? So you actually have groups in the United States taking their cues, right, from Zionist strategies.
And not just the cues, but their training.
They're training. Yeah. So you have a group like the Hindu American Foundation, which is aligned with the Hindu right in India, sharing platforms with the ADL and other groups. And the most sort of obvious expression of that is this term Hinduphobia, right, which is being weaponized in the same way as anti-Semitism is weaponized to shut down criticism of the Modi government, right? But in the U.S., it has a sort of second a second goal, which is to shut down conversations about caste, right? Because again, there's this real fear of caste as a fragmenting force, right, which undermines Hindu unity. Right. So in the same way that caste is disavowed by the Hindu right in India, you have echoes of that now in the US, right? Yeah.
Can I just say how beautifully and organically you guys have brought us to that bridge question that I was hoping we would get to towards the end of the conversation? But Lori, can you mention more about the training? That's news to me.
I don't know that much, but I know that people like Azad Issa and there are some other people who are doing research on the actual political lobbying groups that are receiving training from Zionist support institutions in the US. So Hindutva lobbyists are getting this kind of training. I can't name the organization.
One thought that surfaced for me about the bridge as the conversations went on was how strong a bridge Islamophobia or Islam as the enemy might be. I mean, because I could see it working perfectly, or I could see them not being structural parallel. So what do you guys think? Is it important that Islam is a common
Very
enemy?
much so. I think so. In many ways, Netanyahu individually and Israel writ large has come to stand for a lot of Islamophobic countries as a strong man to emulate and learn from. Their bashing, their mobilization of terrorism and the need for nationalist security that somehow justifies their quashing of any resistance and the oppression of Palestinians, who are not, by the way, all Muslim, but for the sake of an ethno-nationalist project who's counting the 20% Christians. And so I think that Israel kind of stands for this, and you see this kind of bromance between Modi and Netanyahu at different moments. What do you think, Ajanta?
No, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there's all this sort of these exposés now of about the Modi troll, like the Modi's troll army, playing a hugely consequential role in generating disinformation about October 7th, right? So some of the most kind of lurid social media tweets about beheaded babies and, raped women have all come out of India. So this is like this is what like Hindutvites in India do all the time, right? And they've just kind of repurposed their like domestic disinformation campaign for this new kind of phenomenon.
There was also a final topic, Lori, that I know you had a lot of thoughts about that I hope we got to, which is sort of the nominalism question, or whether it matters what we call a spade, I suppose. So yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was actually interested in what both of you thought about this. And the question is when and how we apply the term fascism to any of these movements or overall projects. And, Natasha and I think Murli, maybe not in the conversation, but in other places, has talked about the necessity of being careful of how we apply fascism to what's going on, because if everything is fascism, then what is it really? And we need to preserve this term for really extreme cases. But I have gained a lot of insight from reading some Black American authors who talk about the fact that, fascism, slavery is fascism. Even Robert Paxton, the great theorist of fascism, has referenced the Ku Klux Klan as perhaps the earliest fascist organization, or recognizing colonialism as a fascist structure. It's a style of politics, right? And so this idea of preserving fascism for really extreme cases, we have to think about extreme from whose perspective. And so a point that I made when we talked with Natasha is that it seems like Israel as a fascist state has only come into common discourse once the Israeli state started turning against Jewish people. And that's with the judicial overhaul. So, the Jewish majority was starting to feel the sharp end of fascism, whereas, of course, Palestinians have been living under a military dictatorship since the beginning. So I actually wondered what both of you thought about how we use this term and what use is it?
I mean, the other thing that she said, well, that both of them said, was that there are if you just trace the kind of genealogy of these movements, there's a shared history, right? So I think in both respects, both attending to that shared history and not being, blindsided by the fact that, these were populations that were subject to forms of colonial and fascist power themselves, right? Not letting that sort of blind us to this family resemblance, not just family resemblance, but actual sort of historical connections. So I think that's one thing. But the other is what you said, Lori, like being self-aware about when we are willing to use the term, right? And what that says about normalized violence, right? So whether you're talking about Black people in post-Reconstruction South or Kashmiris, right? From their vantage point, the US and India have been fascist for a very long time, right? From the vantage point of Kashmiris, India is a settler colonial state. So I do think that that's a really, really important reminder. That these not just that these terms are important to specify, but that we need to be conscious of why they're not used. For particular instances, right?
And part of why they're not used is because after World War II, the term carried a certain ideological / moral weight, right? It now means something bad. I mean, we might see that shifting again as people, proudly claim to be fascist, and the whole notion of a
illiberal democracy. Illiberal democracy, I was going to say, is the phrase that I think does a lot of cover work for that, because you can somehow, it's respectable to be an illiberal Democrat, which, as far as I can tell, does mean a fascist, right? Because it means majoritarian control of the country on the basis of like some assumed demographic ideal or real Hungary or whatever.
That's why I object to this term ethnic democracy or ethno-democracy that puts the emphasis on democracy without mentioning that it's democracy for some.
You guys are the experts here, but in terms of your point about the genealogy, I thought that wonderful detail that Natasha brought up about how I can't even remember what Zionist organization it was, but they used to wear brown shirts, and then the memo went out in the 1920s, oh, you guys got to switch to blue shirts. And so somehow, like, putting on blue shirts, that totally insulates you from the genealogical connection to the brown shirts.
In uniform, doing the exercises. Right? Wow. Yeah.
So I would love to end by sort of semi-springing on you guys, something that we always do, and which actually, Ajanta, you remember it from the last time, but it's recallable books, meaning people who enjoyed this conversation, is there a book you would like to mention and say, they ought to go off and take a look at that book? And Lori, I know you already have one in mind, so.
I've got multiple, so it's kind of hard to choose, but one that I haven't mentioned in our conversation so far is a book called Revolutionary Yiddishland, A History of Jewish Radicalism. And it's quite a remarkable book. It translated from French into English not too long ago, but it's a kind of compilation of ethnographic interviews of Jewish people who have refused Zionism. Specifically, it's focused largely, I think, around World War II. But I think it's important for these narratives and histories that refuse the nationalist monopolization of history telling, in this case, refusing the Zionist telling where all Jews belong to Israel, is really important to keep alive. And that's why I think, the work of Natasha's work itself is really important, because that's a kind of the history of the extreme right in Zionism has not been forefronted for obvious reasons in especially American Jewish understanding of Israel.
That's awesome. And Ajanta, I'm just stalling a bit, so I'll go first to give you time to think of one. But first of all, I want to say, just apropos of the nominalism, I forgot to mention this before, Lori, but I really appreciate the point that you made kind of in passing and very politely about using the word diaspora or diasporic to think about the Jewish, the description of Jews in Europe as if they were somehow dispersed rather than like of that place, and how that might be, an ethno-nationalist move that European anti-Semites would make in the 19th century, but that it was in Israel's interest to make it in a later time. And I think growing up as in a Jewish family in the 1970s, I probably just, incorporated that as simply the language of description. So I really love that corrective. And I guess I would connect that to the book I will choose. It's really easy because I already mentioned it. We did a Recall This Book conversation with Joshua Cohen, whose novel, The Netanyahus, which is about one of these children of Jabotinsky, literally Bibi Netanyahu's father, who himself Ben-Zion Netanyahu. And it's this hilarious comedic romp of like the worst job interview on earth. But he comes to America, to assimilationist 1950s America, and meets this kind of 1950s Philip Roth type character who just wants to be a secular Jew, a Jewish historian of the 18th century America. And then he just has this kind of Zionist, this Zionist Jabotinskyite is sort of foisted on this secular Jewish family. So it's a description of this weekend from hell, told from the perspective of both the Zionist outsider and the kind of would-be assimilationist American Jew.
One of my go-to books to get at the kind of lived reality of religion, right? And the sort of the remarkable heterogeneity of South Asia is Susan Bailey's Saints, Goddesses, and Kings. And the subtitle is Muslims and Christians in South Indian Society. And it's a historical ethnography. It's historical ethnography. And it's just a remarkable account of just religious plurality, social dynamism, right? And even though, she doesn't talk about Hindu nationalism, it sort of throws into relief the violence of the project, right? This effort to sort of impose this kind of monolithic history on it's a subcontinent, right? It's called a subcontinent for a reason. So I think that book is one that I really cherish.
Lori was waving around a different book. I don't know if you want to rise to that.
I mean, this is one that we actually referenced in our conversation with Murli, which is the work of Christoph Jafferlo, who's, I think the most important scholar of the Hindu right. And his most recent book is this sort of amazing, rich account of Modi, right? And what the sort of Modi phenomenon has done both to the Hindu right and to India more broadly. And it's called Modi's India. What's the subtitle, Lori?
Hindu Nationalism and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Okay, I think with that, I just want to thank you guys so much and say that this, wide-ranging conversation, and also the two conversations before it that you hosted and brought to Recall This Book, which were just wonderful, has been a real pleasure. So the same thanks I would also extend to those of you listening at home. And if you enjoyed this conversation, definitely check out the Recall This Book archive at our website. But for all of us here at the podcast, and also on behalf of Elizabeth Berry as well, Ajanta, Lori, thanks a ton. It's been great.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for letting us be involved.
Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.